Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. A North Carolina school board passed a policy this week aligning itself with the Biden administration's expansion of Title IX, which has faced numerous lawsuits and legal setbacks, including an injunction prohibiting it from being implemented in hundreds of schools across the country. Joining me to dig into this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, tell us about this policy and how it conflicts with the recent ruling on Title IX.
Yeah, so Wake County School Board voted last week to adopt a policy which basically echoes the Department of Education's definition of sex discrimination, the Title IX, and that basically would include an expanded definition of sex discrimination to include gender identity, right? So basically a school board taking the Department of Education's Biden administration Title IX rewrite, as some people call it, expansion, and adding in that language to the school's policy. So basically redefining sex discrimination to include gender identity, I think pregnancy status, like these kinds of things, which are included in that bigger Biden administration law, right? So that's sort of the context of saying like, hey, there's a deadline coming up. There's this new policy from the Biden administration, and we're going to change our policy to make it clear that this is what sex discrimination is, right? We're seeing that come down the pike. Like it's time to get with it and put it in there because that's that has the force of law. But then, as you mentioned, there's an injunction, right? So then we're kind of in this legal sort of gray area where, there's a court order that stops the Biden administration from implementing this rule in hundreds of schools, I think thousands of institutions, right? So that includes K-12 schools, public schools, but it also includes in other schools. Title IX applies to anything that receives federal funding, and institutions as well of higher education, right? So there's these different kinds of places where that's been prohibited from being implemented, even in states like California and New York, which were not suing the Biden administration. So most of the backlash of the litigation over this Title IX expansion has come from Republican-led, attorney generals from Republican-led states, right, where you have this pushback, arguing that it's unconstitutional and violates different constitutional rights for students or for different administrative procedure act. So that those kinds of questions, raising them. But now you see that kind of happening in places like New York and California, and that's sort of the recent background of this.
And so this particular school, doesn't it fall under the specific injunction against schools with certain organizations?
Yes. So this, the Wake County Public School Systems, I believe that's the name of it. They have one school there called Ligon Magnet Middle School, and that is listed on the court documents where the Biden administration is not able to enforce its rule because of the ongoing litigation. So in that case, it's Kansas versus Cardona, and basically Kansas, Alaska, Utah, and Wyoming, along with Young America's Foundation, Female Athletes United, and Moms for Liberty, sued the Biden administration about these rules, right, and said you can't implement these because they violate the Constitution in these ways. And then a judge said, yeah, like you have a good, it's not like a final order, but until the court can rule in on it, the Biden administration is blocked from implementing the rule in those states, and also schools where students are members of Young America's Foundation or Female Athletes United or whose parents belong to Moms for Liberty. And as it turns out, one of those Wake County schools, Ligon Magnet Middle School, is on that list, right? So that starts getting into that, legally like dicey kind of thing. It does not apply to the whole school system, but it does apply to that one middle school. So how, what is sort of the intersection? And that's one reason why we wanted to look into the story at Chalkboard. It's like, what is the intersection of like these federal rules, the court order, and then also local policy, at the school board level of like, how do you implement that? And essentially the school board, the attorney said that the court orders prohibit the Department of Education from enforcing the Title IX rule, but it doesn't mean the school cannot pass its own policy. And to be honest, I'm not sure like what is going to happen here. I don't know if like a court is going to weigh in on this and say like, absolutely not. Like the school board like cannot pass a policy mirroring the Department of Education because of the Department of Education's so the scary part is, and this was mentioned by a school board member, that the department, if you don't follow the rules for the Department of Education, you lose federal funding, right? That's the risk. And, if you have some Title I schools, if you have a lot of federal money coming in, for anybody, that's a big problem, right? And I think that it could be, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a lot of money for school lunches, and you have a lot of different kinds of funds coming from the federal government for these school systems. And so that's a big problem. You're not going to go and try to cross them, right? Because you don't want to risk your federal funding. So I think that a court could look at that and say, well, given sort of the weight of the federal funding mechanism, there is sort of that pressure there, and that, following the policy, or following the Biden administration's rules, just because you're afraid of that federal funding being withheld. So I think it is going to take some more court orders or opinions to try to figure out where that the impetus lies for following the law, right? And it's sort of this interesting intersection of we had we had the rule in place, now the court order, and so now there's this policy, and it's kind of in between those, right? It's sort of trying to appease everybody.
And these sorts of questions came up during kind of the public discussion prior to this policy being implemented. What were some of the things each side was saying about this?
Yeah. So, on the one side, you have the very critical, Moms for Liberty, saying hey, you should not, move forward with this. Basically, you're prohibited from making these changes because of the injunction, right? This would be, you're risking serious legal repercussions, and that, if the Moms for Liberty branch could sue over this, right? And you're opening yourself up to a lawsuit, you should not do this. On the other side, you have the school, a school board member, his name is Sam Hershey, and he was basically saying we could get fined, right? We could lose $100 million of federal funding. And then more broadly too, he asked the question, what is our role as a school board, right? What do we do when we're handed a federal mandate, and then, sort of this, that we feel we need to follow, and then a state mandate? And he pointed to, if you're excited about the school board following a state mandate that says you have to have a bill of parental rights, right? And say, here's what parents are allowed to do. And, we affirm this. And then if a state law says you have to post that on your website and you have to follow it, because you're a public school in the state, do you stand, if you're excited about that, then don't they also have to follow the law when the Biden administration says something that maybe you don't like, right? So I think his question for parents was you can applaud one thing and you can hate the other thing either way, right? But do you stand up and say, as a school board, do you stand up and say, we're not going to follow what seems to be the law right now? Or do you say, we have to do this, and we try to mitigate the risk by complying? What is the role of a school board in these kinds of things, right? And so I do think that that's very interesting. And we've seen a number of different approaches. In this case, they said we're going to side with compliance, and we're going to go with the Department of Education's rules for Title IX and implement this policy mirroring it. And there was a couple of votes against it in the school board. But you also have school boards in California, for example, who are going against the parental notification bill there, and I think are suing the state over that. So again, you do have some school boards saying we're going to stand up and we're going to take a stand. In Oklahoma as well, there's some school superintendents, I think, I don't know if it's school boards, but saying we're not going to implement the Oklahoma law, a mandate for teaching the Bible in class. So it's one of these interesting questions that kind of is brought up here about what is the role of the school board in following these laws and trying to mitigate risk, but I think ultimately if you violate the Constitution and you're found guilty of that, then, you might be opening yourself up to. So I think to lawsuits, right, to litigation. So I think that it's sort of, you have to balance everything, and it is legally murky, and there's a lot of different legal murkiness. I think some of that will probably be resolved here in the coming weeks, and if not months.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. It's something we've been following as the lawsuits have come through and different injunctions have been ruled on, and we will continue to follow it. Listeners can keep up with it at chalkboardnews.com.